Thanks for staying with us. The Executive Director of the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls has written an open letter to Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube. Gugulethu Ndebele's remarks focus on early childhood development, an area she believes needs to be focused more on children. She argues that education is the front, back and center of any nation, especially a developing one like ours. Gugulethu Ndebele joins us live now in studio. Good evening and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with talking about early childhood development. We often talk about this, it's been years now. And when the decision was made for this sector to now be moved towards basic education, some say that it was a good move, others were still skeptical. You argue in your letter that it was a good move. Tell us why.
I think first, thank you for having me. I think it's a good move because education is a pipeline. I think what we don't realize in South Africa is that if you put education at the center and all the other services in the service of education, you achieve greater results. Part of the problem with having it at DSD, it became a social development issue rather than an education issue. And so if you put it and it links to grade R and it links to foundation phase, and so it's a pipeline. So if we want to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve, the people who are at the outcomes end must know what's happening at the entrance. So if it's in another department, it doesn't make sense. And it's the same whether you're talking about school nutrition, whether you're talking about school health. It has to be in the school because it supports the educational and social development of the child.
And while it does that, at the same time, there is still a concern in 2024. Right now, we still find ourselves with children who simply aren't in school, who simply are not part of any early childhood learning development facility. What impact, in your view, because you've been in the education space for a long time, what impact does this have on a child in the long run? Because we sometimes look at things for now, but it does have an impact in the long run.
At the risk of being controversial, I'm going to say that part of the problem with us as a country and a government is that instead of solving the problem of foundational education, we move boxes. So it was in DSD, it's going to be in education, it might end up somewhere else. And the impact for that is long term. I've just saw a clip now in the news about the matric exams, and we talk about the dropout rate, only 40%. 40% dropout from those who started. The reason, so some of the reasons for the dropout is the lack of foundational education. And so if you don't strengthen that, and there are other reasons, there's obviously teenage pregnancy, there's economic issues, gender-based violence, but the big part of it is that there's no foundation. And so if you don't have that as a starting point, there's less chance of achieving quality outcomes in grade 12.
And especially because, as you say, when we listen to all the technical briefings, you always want to listen out to how much of a percentage are we dealing with now of those who've been lost along the system. But there's also another issue. The moving it from the Department of Social Development to basic education. And I'm interested because you are writing about this as well, is that there needed to be a stronger focus on who teaches these children at this level as well, but also quality assurance needed to also be done.
Yep, absolutely. I think the extent to which you can achieve quality outcomes in learning depends on the quality of the teachers. And in a sector like this, as big as the ECD sector, that has predominantly been my mother looking after 20 kids and making them play. The transition needs to accept that that's the bulk of the system. And so how do you empower without making them lose their jobs? How do you empower those people who took their time and energy to keep these kids out of the school or out of an education environment? But also, how do you start creating a pipeline of quality ECD educators that are going to make sure that the quality of the outcomes, and exactly what you're saying, how do we make sure that the centers that the children are at are quality assured? Because some of them do not have basic facilities. So what is the responsibility of government in ensuring that those centers that are existing are equipped to look after the lives of our children.
And you know, you're mentioning something that is so critical, especially when you say that those centers that would have been there before the transition should not feel like they're now being, you know, pushed out of the system. And how do you begin to capacitate them? Because, for example, Ugogo Mkhize would be there and trying to help the children be out of trouble and making sure that at least the parents know where the children are when they come back from work. So how then does the conversation begin to capacitate her and make sure that her center is made stronger instead of the center shutting down and then not knowing where the parents can send their children?
Firstly, it's to get the gogo feel valued, because she's been doing this for a very long time without government support or anything. Secondly, is to accept the limitations of gogo, and therefore say, as a government department, what do I need to have in support of gogo? You know, what kinds of things, whether it's resources, whether it's young interns, whatever it is, what do I need to make sure that gogo doesn't feel threatened, but gogo knows that her part comes from here to here. And in most part, it's play. Because I was raised by a gogo, so what I remember most, it's the storytelling and it's the play. And so how do we then use all of these young people that are in education to channel them into ECD so that they support gogo? And how do we create centers of support around those centers so that they don't feel isolated?
And I suppose it speaks to addressing the issue of budget cuts, which the minister is also talking about as well, because once you are cutting the budgets, you then are making what you're talking about difficult.
Yeah, I've always been perplexed at how, as a country, we always say education is a priority. And then we do everything in our power to conspire against making it a priority. Because if education is a priority, every government department, in my view, should, when they report to cabinet, say, this is what we're doing for education and in education. If it's public works, how many of those pit latrines have you eradicated? How many schools have you built? If it's health, how many services have you put in the service of the child? If it's DSD, how many children have got grants? Home Affairs, how many have got IGs? And then you don't look at budget as the money that's been given to education, but as money that resides in all of these sectors. Secondly, I don't understand the decision to cut teachers. Already our classrooms are overcrowded. So if you're saying because of budget cuts, you're going to cut teacher supply, it boggles the mind, because the people that are mostly affected are the people that are furthest away from opportunity. It's not the people that are served by my school who are in the private schooling system. It's the bulk of the people that are already experiencing inequality. So the budget cuts are not going to affect Quintile 5 or 4 schools. They're going to affect those schools that are already feeling the burden of lack of quality education.
And certainly a conversation that continues. Thank you so much for stopping by. It's always good to have people in studio.
Thank you very much.
Because a lot of people opt for online, but thank you so much for this conversation. That was Gugulethu Ndebele, the Executive Director of the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls. On that note, Oli is coming up next with sport.